we're embarking on the prayer of Nehemiah. And I want to say that we're actually focusing on intercessory prayer. Intercessory prayer is best described as standing in the gap in prayer on behalf of someone else, whether it's for their personal needs or praying for the nations. And because we're standing in the gap, we're straddling two spheres between earth and heaven. And therefore, we can meet resistance in the place of intercession. In other words, we can be involved in spiritual warfare. Prayer itself is our relationship with God, and intercessory prayer comes out of our relationship with God. Some of you know a little bit about me, know that God has called me to be an intercessor, and I pray in an intercessory group. And for me, that's my happy place. It can be a Holy Spirit gift from God, but it is also meant to be that we all intercede for other people. Nehemiah was quite literally a mender of broken walls. And when we intercede for other people, we are often asking God to rebuild or reconcile something that's been broken. He was a contemporary of Ezra, and he was called by God to go back to Jerusalem about 13 years after God had called Ezra to re-establish Jerusalem back to its spiritual roots. The remnant that is mentioned in these opening verses are the survivors of the Babylonian exile, where Nebuchadnezzar took the people of Israel back into slavery in Babylon, and he sacked the city of Jerusalem. Israel had strayed far from God. They'd indulged all manner of idolatry, so God gave them over to their sinful desires, and the result was exile. And it was in exile they were meant to become desperate for God. And now, although the exile was over, the remnant was still in a bad way. What these people was needed was to be revived. And this is where Ezra and Nehemiah became the instruments whereby Israel could be revived. Nehemiah at the time was a cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes. Now the cupbearer had the responsibility to taste the wine of the king to see if it was poisoned. He was not like Gilly Goulden or Os Clarke, who was smelling the bouquet to see whether it fitted well with the evening meal. He was tasting it for poison. So the king was trusting his life to the cupbearer. And because of their trusted position, cupbearers were able to influence a lot of political influence in the royal court. If Nehemiah got it wrong, he'd have been poisoned. So he had to be aware of the goings on in the court. He had to be aware who the king's enemies were, because he would have been poisoned. His position was affluent and secure, but it wasn't comfortable. Intercessors have to be informed, maybe investigate, especially when we're praying for nations. And we also have to watch in prayer the backs of other people. When we're praying for other people, we're watching their backs, loving over them. The one thing we might do at the moment is switch off the news, because we can't stand what's coming on the news. It's so depressing at the moment. Please don't switch off the news. Interceding for the nations is really, really important, and you need to know what's on God's heart. So just forget about the doom and gloom and place yourself under the sovereignty of God and know that you're safe, whatever the news says, and pray for those nations. Basically, the book of Nehemiah is a man's memoirs, his memoirs of how he sought God and what God asked him to do. And it didn't bother him that in order to do what God had asked him to do, that he would need to abandon the splendour of Persia and go back to Jerusalem and assist Ezra by rebuilding the walls. And the first thing we see in his prayer, that he was a seeker after God's heart. I believe that made him a revivalist prayer as well as a godly leader. Godly leaders are prayers. I think over the years that you have had me as part of Skipton Baptist Church, you will have gleaned that my burning desire is to see God revive his church. It occupies a lot of my thoughts every day as I pray for it. I've been praying for revival since 2008, and I am not going to stop until it happens, or unless God calls me home. The prayer team that I am part of have been praying for revival for 22 years, almost as long as Pete Gregg. The reason I pray for revival of the church is that our nation, is dependent upon the church's restoration so that it too can be healed. Psalm 33 verse 12 says, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord." And in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, our CWM team had this word from God that we were to pray as according to 2 Chronicles 7:14. "If my people who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and forgive their sins and heal their lands." This is a biblical precedent at work here. If we want to see the British Isles healed, then the church needs to be revived. And we need to recognise how important it is to seek the face of God as paramount. Nehemiah knew this when he prayed for the remnant. They needed to be revived. The Spirit of God needed to enter their lives, which was Ezra's call. But they also had to see the walls of Jerusalem being restored, so it was keeping them on track. If you look into the history of revival, God raised up intercessors who sought the face of God. If you go onto the BU website, you can read an article about the Hebridean revival, where those two old ladies prayed for young people to come to the church because there was no young people in the kirk, a bit like churches today. Look at the article if you can, because it describes the revival in the Hebrides, the direct result of these dear little intercessors. Nehemiah sought God's face. Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Nehemiah saw that God was unique. He saw that God was sovereign. He saw that God was reliable, powerful, merciful, compassionate, and utterly holy. And as a result of his intercession and Ezra's re-establishment of the spiritual roots of Israel, we see the fulfillment of some of Jeremiah chapter 29, which is very well known, where Jeremiah exhorts how the Israelites are to live while they're in exile. But from verse 11, it's talking about when they return from exile. It says, "I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you." We see them on cards that we might send to somebody for their birthday. But we don't read the next bit, which says, "Then you will call on me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me, and you will find me when you seek me with all of your heart." And in Nehemiah 8, this is what happens. The walls have been rebuilt. Ezra has read the law, and the people lifted up their hands and responded. Then they bowed down and worshipped. Nehemiah sought God's face as he interceded for the nation. The two ladies in the Hebrides sought God's face, and as a result the people were restored, revived, and began to worship and seek God's face for themselves. And I believe God is calling his church today to do just that, to seek his face. It's so easy for us here at SBC to think we've got good worship here, we've got absolutely great teaching, which we have. But very gently I want to say to you, you're not there yet. We are not there yet. It's time for us to intercede and seek God's face for this part of God's church, for SBC. When I found the joy of reaching your heart, that's what the song says. Look into his holiness, gaze into his loveliness, when all the things that surround me become shadows in the light of you. God's calling SBC to that. Then we see Nehemiah as a weeping intercessor. News came to the court that the remnant were in deep trouble. Ezra had led a second group of exiles back to Jerusalem to help them to become a God-fearing community, but they began to stray into their former sins. And message got back to Nehemiah. And when he heard this news, he mourned and he fasted for days. We're not sure how long it was, probably a couple of months actually. He mourned and he fasted. So let's tackle mourning first, and then I'll come back to fasting. Intercession is the kind of prayer that calls for compassion and empathy, and sometimes things can be going on in a person's life or a nation's life that stirs up tears and grief, real mourning. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. In a sense, we're talking not so much about the death of somebody, but the sin of somebody. Blessed are we when we mourn over our sin. So Nehemiah was called, I believe, to what is called a ministry of tears, and it's part of the intercessory's armour. It's totally biblical to weep on behalf of the people we're praying for. One thing that intercessory prayer does is keeps us in touch with our emotions, which we know can often go a bit wild and wacky, but we actually need to engage them when we're interceding for others, because we're standing in the gap for that person, putting ourselves in their shoes. The tears of Nehemiah was not self-centered, it was self-giving. It was deep compassion for this remnant that were 1,000,000 miles off what Ezra wanted them to be. They were still perpetuating the sin of the past. And it broke Nehemiah's heart. And he felt it at the very core of his emotions. He felt their lostness. And so he wept and he mourned. And it really is important that as intercessors, we're not afraid to do that. Jesus did it at the tomb of Lazarus. In verse 35 of John chapter 11, it says, Jesus wept. And in verse 38, once more, Jesus was deeply moved. You can almost feel the cry of his heart. His precious friend had died. He felt the pain of his loss. He felt the pain for Martha and Mary. And so he wept at the tomb. But there was something deeper going on there, because in the Greek, Jesus wept. It's suggesting there was a deep anguish in his heart that was a bit like a horse that snorted with anguish. And it wasn't that his friend had died, but that it was a death itself. And he was pained in his heart, a death itself, which in a few days' time he was going to defeat. He'd lost Lazarus, but he was incensed with this snorting, this anger at death itself. So he wept. It said Jesus wept. There was great emotion behind that prayer, great vulnerability, great feeling behind that prayer. And when we're interceding and standing in the shoes of somebody else and empathizing with them, our emotions need to be touched as well as our mind. Yet this kind of intercession doesn't necessarily have to be passive. As we weep on behalf of other people, we may be asked or called to do something as well. And Jesus did. He went to the cross and he died. Nehemiah did. He went to Jerusalem and built the walls. It's a kind of intercession where we become vulnerable, whereas we ourselves lay ourselves down and give ourselves wholly to another person and pray for the relief in their lives, or whole countries as well. Now, this is me being vulnerable. Sometimes I weep for the church, and my heart breaks for the church, because the church has swept sin under the carpet for decades. We have willingly accepted lies as truth. There are people in churches who behave in the most ungodly fashion towards one another. There's rivalry within ministry. There's complacency and there's apathy, and we've shoved these under the carpet. And sometimes when I pray, I break my heart at those things before God. I weep before God. And there are times when I say, God, can I have a day off, please? The next thing about Nehemiah was he fasted. Now, this is a thorny issue because part of Nehemiah's prayer was in fasting. Many Christians don't even consider that fasting is all that important, or even consider a reason for fasting, and frankly just don't fast. Yet it's a biblical concept, and it runs through the entirety of the Bible. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6, Jesus says, when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites. And when you pray, go to your room. Jesus wasn't saying if you pray, because he presupposes that his followers will pray. Later on in the chapter, he says, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites. But when you fast, put on oil on your head and wash your face. And just like prayer, Jesus presupposes that his followers will fast. Fasting is essentially denying ourselves in order to spend time with God. Why then does Jesus put this emphasis upon the need for believers to fast? What is it about fasting that makes it so important? And the answer is very simple. To fast is to humble ourselves before God. David in Psalm 35 and verse 13 says, I humbled my soul with fasting. The Israelites always associated fasting with humbling themselves. Our soul is the seat of our ego. It's our carnal self. And when we're fasting, we're putting to death part of our carnality. And so when we deny ourselves food, we're calling our ego into line with God's will. And our ego that says, I want, I think, I feel, I can do it, I will do it my way. And instead, we're preferring to bring our will in line with what's in God's heart. So you can see why Jesus puts an emphasis upon it. When we fast, we are submitting to God's ways and not our own way. We are placing our dependence wholly on him. And in the place of intercession, fasting means that we deny ourselves so that we can, through prayer, release God's healing, restoring power over people's lives. May I suggest that you read Derek Prince's book, Shaping History Through Prayer and Fasting. All great moves of God have been accompanied by prayer and fasting. In intercessory prayer, we sometimes are taking on the powers of darkness, and I want to give you an example of fasting and prayer as a group, which is what we do periodically in CWM. We do corporate fasts. And if you look back to 2011, you might remember the riots that we had across the nation that were particularly bad in London, and they began to progress northwards. So as a team, we called churches together to come and pray. But as a team, we fasted and prayed that Liverpool would be spared what London and Manchester and other places had had. We asked God to spare us. And we had very, very little of the rioting. And that was directly resulting to praying with fasting. God hears the cries of the humble. So it makes sense to humble ourselves through fasting. For Nehemiah, he was praying for the Jewish nation to be revived. He was also asking God to give him a strategy to rebuild those walls. Now, there are practicalities about fasting. If you've got a physical condition that prevents you from fasting food, please don't fast food. There are other ways of fasting than fasting food. We can turn off the TV. It's got an on-off button. We can turn off a mobile phone. We can put social media away for a whole day. We can lock up the man shed. We can give up being shopaholics. We can put aside our hobbies to spend time, to deny ourselves and put ourselves in the place of prayer, to ask God to move by humbling our carnal natures. The final bit is the confessing intercessor, and this might be something very, very odd to all of us in some way. And it was prophets in the Bible that did it, in the Old Testament that did it. But it's possible to be a confessing intercessor in a corporate sense. I don't think God's calling us to be a Nehemiah or a Moses who interceded by confessing on behalf of people. But what I want to try and do is unpack it very, very loosely as best as I possibly can. He was a man who was humbling himself before God, and he was standing in the gap of the remnant of the exiles. And part of his prayer was to confess his own sinfulness, but also the sinfulness of those returning exiles, because what was happening to them was the sins of their past was being perpetuated in their present. And so what Nehemiah was doing was identifying with their sins of the past, because they were part of his backstory. They were his ancestors. So he was standing in the gap, not just in prayer, but in history. And he was interceding by confessing his sins, and confessing their sins by identifying with them. He couldn't actually confess for their particular sins because they weren't his, but he could identify with them. And that is what he was doing. He was standing in the gap, in the place of history this time, to bring healing over their present. I hope I've explained that well. I'll just give you an example and then I'll be finished. In 2008, it was the capital year of culture in Liverpool. And many Christians gathered together at the Maritime Museum in a formal act of confession for Liverpool's part in the slave trade. All of us there were abhorrent at slavery, and we were standing in the gap for present-day slavery as well. And we were confessing our own sinful nature, but we were identifying with the sinful nature of the slave traders, and particularly the church, who had profited from the money of the slave trade in Liverpool. And so we stood there together corporately and stood in the gap in prayer and confessed our sin and identified by confessing for the sins of our backstory, our ancestry. And there was an amazing result. Not long after that prayer, Liverpool began a time of remarkable regeneration. Buildings were shooting up. There was a brand new museum put up. Lots of great things began to happen in the city of Liverpool, whereas before we were seen as the city where people nicked your tyres off your car. The only good thing about Liverpool was the Beatles. But we'd stood in the gap in time as well as in the present. Now, I do hope I haven't overloaded you about intercession, but bless you as you explore and come before God in prayer for other people and nations.